would just be like completely disproportionate to what life was actually throwing at me.
Yeah.
And that's where the conversation around homesick came, because that's where you're actually going to talk to this stuff. Well, I didn't do that second part at all. I lied, or I withheld, or I hid all of these issues extraordinarily well. And they're going, great, well, you're probably just homesick. So that, for me, I dismissed the concept. I didn't really understand mental health at all at this stage, and really didn't get to the help part with anyone in my mind in a meaningful way until I got to the worst state, when I really had to put my hand up and be like, this is not working.
Tom, thank you for joining me on The Bottom Line.
It's great to be here, mate. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's a little bit different. I was on SEN, so thank you for the invite. I had a pleasure being a guest on your show. So get to repeat the favour here, and we roles the reverse. So, but before we get into it, tell us a little bit about yourself. Someone that may be hiding under a cave that doesn't know who you are. Take us through who you are for those listeners.
Yeah, well, firstly, on the SEN thing, it's slightly different here. We get a bit more time and space to actually talk through things. Unfortunately, the content required for radio is very snappy, which is fun. Like, it's fast paced, and you get sort of better at slimming down your answers to be valuable in shorter periods of time, which I actually think is a good thing. I mean, you can tend to waffle a bit on programs where you have a lot of space and time. But my background very much came sort of as a regular kid, suburban upbringing here in Melbourne. Grew up in a place called Ringwood, very hefty sort of sporting background throughout my juniors and as I progressed through to playing AFL football. And I think primarily, my sort of value set and upbringing from, one side of my family being my father was very much around this sort of hard work and toughness and leadership and always putting yourself forward and being extremely sort of driven. And then on the other side of the coin from my mum, who was from a Danish background, was really around this people element, like being professional, being people-driven, very heavy on the manners, the Scandinavians. And those two things in particular, I think, would provide the greatest reflection of how I've sort of progressed through my life. By the age of 15, I was captain of Victoria in the football side of things, playing basketball alongside the likes of Dante Exum and Ben Simmons. Those guys were better than me, don't get me wrong. But I played in the same teams for a couple of years there, and really got to a stage where sport was just too all-consuming. I was doing probably 12 or 13 sessions of sport a week.
Wow.
We're traveling at 5 a.m. out to Waverley to do these sort of intensive basketball programs, going to school all day, which, my parents continually reinforced was actually the priority. School is number one. That became a bit harder to justify later on, but, I did very well in my studies as well. And really got to a point where I had to choose which sport to play. And luckily enough, made the decision to play football. Was much more in line with my dad. He played a little basketball growing up. Don't know how successfully, but he was quite a prolific footballer in the eastern suburbs. And then, 2 years later, I go pick one in the draft to the Giants.
How old were you?
Just turned 18.
Just turned 18, yeah.
Yeah, just turned 18. And I think, around that period of time, lots of things change very quickly, right? You go through basically leaving school, having to be independent, living out of home. You become a professional footballer as opposed to the amateur one that you were prior to being drafted, which is a big dynamic change, especially in a sort of team context. And then on top of that, you also basically go from being this big fish in a small pond to now playing against the best guys across the country, all the while trying to work out how to live in Sydney. It was a big change for me at that stage. And after sort of 12 months, to give the very high-level view, returned back to Victoria on a big deal with the Western Bulldogs, 7 years, $7 million. I think made me the third highest-paid player in AFL history at 18 years old.
In history?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, not anymore.
Not anymore.
No, not anymore. There's plenty of guys making more money than that now. And again, to keep a long story short, won a premiership at 21 with the Bulldogs, played a great game on that day, had some incredible moments, and then essentially retired at the age of 23 to sort of take the next step in my life.
It's a very short summary. Let's unwind it and unpack it a little bit. Take us through the conversations you were having with clubs around the time of draft. So I know GWS was around the time of sort of coming into the league, and they would have had first pick because you got first pick.
Yeah.
But was there any chance that you could go anywhere else? What were the conversations you're having with clubs? Because being a Victorian boy, was Sydney guaranteed, or what were your thoughts pre-draft days?
Yeah, I think like most things, the level of variability gets smaller and smaller as you approach the draft, right? Because you got to remember, these things obviously don't happen overnight. They're usually basically a 3-year runway to the draft, right? So from the under-16s national carnival, even to a degree, much smaller degree, I would argue, the under-15 schoolboys, which I didn't play a part in. The under-16s national carnival is kind of your first moment. From there, you basically move into the Australian Institute of Sports sides, which existed back then. I think they're now called the AFL Academy. And then you go into essentially under-17s Vic Metro and under-18s Vic Metro. And that's kind of the pinnacle, right? So basically around, I think it's the middle school holidays or somewhere around that in the middle of the year, you play all of these national games against the other states. And that's when the best come against the best because, frankly, 70% of the talent in most drafts sits here in Victoria based on size and obviously cultural commitment to footy as a whole. And then you sort of have obviously significant talent usually coming out of SA and WA. And then the rest of the country, vastly speaking, is kind of considered Division 2 in many ways. Not to say there's not great players, but from a sort of volume point of view, there's not as many. And so for me, I started the season after having an incredibly strong under-17s year really, really well, right? I played probably 7 or 8 games before I got injured. I was kicking 5 goals a game.
Wow.
It was an incredible start. Like probably one of the great patches of junior footy, I would say, of the time.
So you also peaked at a good, like you were peaking, right, in your junior career?
Yeah, and then I had an ankle injury in Perth against WA. So I basically went over there as part of the national championship. And I remember it like it was yesterday. My coach sat me down, the forwards coach, Brent Thiel at the time, and he said, mate, they've got this backman, and he's unbelievable. He's so fast, he's strong, he's athletic, he's the best, right? His name's Alir, who's obviously gone on to have a great AFL career. He said, you're going to have to bring out all of your tricks to beat this guy, and he basically kind of like said to me that he's better than you. And I was like, okay, right, let's see how we go. Anyway, when I did my ankle, it was 11 minutes into the first quarter. I snapped everything, 4 months out.
The
whole thing.
Wow.
All of my ankle dislocated. It was a disaster. Having said that, that was taking a mark lining up for my 4th goal at the 11-minute mark.
Oh, no way.
They'd already moved Alir off me and put Tom Barras on me, who, again, has had a fantastic AFL career. I'd say both of them had better careers than me. But at this moment, under 18s, which no one cares about, but it was a big moment for me.
Yeah.
And I tell you that longer piece of context just to say that essentially from a few of those moments and leading into it was Tom's going to go number 1. They also had the Giants that year. They had pick 2 as well. So the likelihood of me going somewhere else was basically 0.
Did anyone even interview did it get to, you would have maybe got some interviews or some conversation with other clubs, but once they had 1 and 2 and it was getting to the pointy end, did other clubs were like, they didn't even bother wasting time in a way?
Pretty
so
much.
Did you? Yeah, okay. So
pretty much. So I mean, like the worst teams in the comp of the day, for want of a better term, and those who desperately needed a key forward were essentially Melbourne, St Kilda, Bulldogs, Carlton to a lesser degree. Kerno came the year after me, and then obviously the Giants. And the Giants didn't need more key forwards. They had Jeremy Cameron and John Patton at that time, but they needed to pick the best available, right?
Yeah.
They were in a completely transient state as a club. 3rd season in the AFL. Hard to keep high picks in one place, especially if they feel like they're missing out on development that they would get elsewhere. But so I met with probably 5 or 6 clubs, maybe over the course of 12 months. But realistically, you get to this point where, how would you say, the end information gathering exercise pretty much for all draftees is the national combine. So you finish your season. That year, I actually came back for the grand final in the TAC Cup. So we'd finished on the bottom the year before, and we ended up winning the premiership by like 20 goals against Dandenong. And my first game since that ankle injury 4 months earlier was in the grand final.
Oh, wow.
And I kicked 3 in the first quarter and then ran out of steam. But anyway, I kicked 4 for the game. It was all right. And straight after that, basically within the next month, there's a combine, which essentially is all of the athletic testing, interviews, psych testing, all, as I said, the information gathering stuff. And one of the big features of this national combine is the clubs interview players, and they have everyone there, right? So in other interviews that you might have throughout the year, it's kind of like the recruiters and the scouts, and it's important, but it's not daunting.
Yeah.
These ones are the head coach.
Wow.
Often the CEOs or the executives, especially if you're a high pick, they want to have some confidence and they want to meet you basically to do that. Contrary to what most people might think, oh, he's the number 1 pick, he's like the most sought after, everyone want to talk to him. No, they don't care because they can't get you and they know they're not going to get you. So they might as well go and talk to the guys who are in flux. So the worst place to be is to be around pick 15 to 25, which means every club wants you.
Yeah, everyone wants to talk to you, right?
Yeah, because they don't know if they're going to be able to get you or not. And so for me, I met with, as I said, basically the clubs that I mentioned before. And also I remember sitting there in the stands because I didn't complete the combine off the back of this ankle injury, and I didn't need to prove anything else. There's probably another part to it. And West Coast, who I'd met a few times over the course of the 12 months earlier, they came up to me and they're like, mate, you look so bored. Do you want to do an interview? They were good at the time, right? So they didn't need to talk to me, but they did an interview with me and it all went really well. But they were just saying, like, trying to give me something to do.
I love it. That's a cool story. So you obviously knew you were probably going to GWS more, or Sydney, to live in Sydney a bit earlier than you thought. And I know you struggled there. We've had conversations offline and not struggled in the sense, but, it was a difficult move and there was some stuff which we'll go through. But take us through sort of just your mindset of, I'm going to go to Sydney. Did you feel anxious at the time or were you excited about the journey? You probably had a lot more time than most draftees knowing where they're going to be. So take us through how you felt and then, and how that played out.
Yeah, I think at the time, there's sort of two things at play that meant that it didn't seem like as big a deal as it probably was going to be. The first was, you're going through school exams. So you got a lot to confront, right? And I as I said, I think I got mid-90s in my ATAR.
Wow.
I was very committed to finalising this big process I'd spent a lot of time working on, and I'd found a way through, basically dropping a subject in year 12 to do both, to do the footy thing, the travel, the training, the leaving school early, all of that stuff, and yet still do well in my studies because I'd been organised and had basically conceded a subject at the start of the year. So finalising that was really critical. And that took the vast majority of my focus at that time. On the flip side, I was also someone who, let's call it the king of the cliches at this stage. I knew everything. I knew exactly what media wanted to hear. And, to a degree, evident in some of the work that I do today, public speaking and speaking as a whole has always been something I've been pretty strong in. So when I was asked those questions, how do you feel about moving? I'm like, mate, I'll move I'll play in the moon if I have to,
That would have eaten that up.
Ate it up. And I believed it too, right? So hence the lack of anxiety in terms of moving. I was like, mate, this is what I've been working for since I was 5 years old. I remember, watching, I was born in 1995. I remember watching the Lions play, right, the three-peat. I remember Jonathan Brown. I remember all these guys. And I remember wanting to do that. I was 6 years old in 2001. And so it seemed like the culmination of a decade and a half of work that I was working towards, which meant that nothing could get in the way of that. Having said that, I'd also spent a heap of time doing these camps and all of this other stuff, right? And to be honest, I hadn't really liked it that much.
Okay.
Like I didn't mind the footy part, but the concept of being with all of these guys who are half your mates.
Yeah, half your mates is a really good comment. It does build from there. But
but only with a few, right? It's kind of like work, right? So maybe to take it back. So I remember leaving school and obviously you build some great friendships at school. But I remember people saying to me, mate, we're going to have the best, we're going to be best mates next year. I'm like, I'll never see you again. Right? And I'm not because I didn't want to, but I knew I was moving to Sydney. I knew that pretty shortly after school, unless you move into the same vein of life, let's call it university for the most part out at Luther College, if you move into a different stream, let's say you go into construction or you get an apprenticeship, you're not going to be with that crowd anymore. Right?
Correct.
It's friendship through convenience, which happens, by the way, it's a great part of work life, right? Having friends that are at work, but they're work friends. They're not friends that you will end up seeing for the rest of your life for the vast majority of people. And if you find one, you're lucky. And so for me, I'd had that experience with these half friends, as I mentioned before. And really, when I arrived in Sydney, the thing that shocked me the most was that it felt like one of those camps, right? In multiple ways, right? Because there's no inherent culture to a program like the Vic Metro teams, right? There's a concept that this is a desirable place to be. There's a history of players who've come through there. There's great people. There's great coaching, all of that stuff. But they still can't get away from the fact that every single year they flip 95% of their list, right? So you can't build a culture with a turnover of 95%. It doesn't exist. And so when I moved to Sydney, we're sitting there with basically 25 first-round picks and we're bringing in 10 players a year. And so for me, it was kind of like walking into the next level up of the Vic Metro experience or the AIS experience I'd had because all those boys had just gone through it, right, in the last 3 years. And I think that was probably the most jarring thing for me. I was like, this isn't the Carlton Footy Club, which I'd grown up supporting. It wasn't the Western Bulldogs with history and an identity. They were building it at the time, and they've done a great job, by the way, doing it. But it wasn't there yet. It was brand new.
Correct. The penny just dropped there. So I can now visualize it. You walk into Hawthorn unveiled their new facilities yesterday, and I'm just, they had all these ex-players, and there's that culture, and it's brand new and shiny, but the culture
Well, it wasn't
follows.
even shiny, right? It wasn't even shiny. We were in an absolute dump of a facility. Well, because they were building their new one at the time, right? So when I first walked in, we were training, right? And obviously people can't see the offices in, but imagine these offices. And, it's probably like 15 metres by 15 metres. That was the entire facility in the underground of the athletic centre that was built for the Sydney Olympics in 2000.
Oh, it's a really old school, 2000.
Old and sort of half being used. Like it was a disaster. And I was like, I'd trained in better facilities at Vic Metro than I was training. So it wasn't even shiny, to your point. Right? I didn't even get that glossy feeling of this was this brand new toy. It was like walking out into a completely unculturally defined, 25-year-old bike. It was such a strange segue from a life that I'd sort of lived previously.
That's interesting. I've listened to a lot of your stuff. I've never heard that. I've never heard you say it like that. So it's a bit of a penny drop moment for me. Now I can kind of feel where you're at in terms of you there. What was your living situation like? Where did you live on your own? Did you live with players?
Yeah, they had this big thing at the Giants in the early days, which I'm sure there's some people who still live in Breakfast Point. But essentially back then they were like, great, these boys are all from Melbourne. The only way we can get this to work is basically make them all live together. So they build these relationships, which means they'll want to stay, is essentially the recipe. And if you move to Victoria, right, let's say you move to Carlton, Carlton will have a syndicate of families that will take in interstate players, right? They'll take them in as basically like a board. They're often supporters of the club. They've had players in the past. Maybe some of the seniors will have players stay with them. Mitch Wallace was a big one of the Bulldogs who used to do that every year for your first month and a half, 2 months. You can't do that in a town that doesn't follow footy, right? And they can't do it in a town where the Giants are the newest kids on the block. They don't have any real infrastructure from a fan point of view. So they put us in these suburbs. If you've ever been to Sydney and actually explored around, the thing with Sydney compared to Victoria is we don't have these privately developed suburbs in the same way, right? Like we have Point Cook and Truganina and Tarnett, like all of these sort of land banks that get developed, very different in Sydney. In Sydney, it's like walking into, and this might be an older reference, I'm 30 now, to the Truman Show. Right? Right? So everything's, it's called Pleasantville or whatever it's called. I can't remember exactly.
Pleasantville.
But everything is, picture perfect. The lawns are all manicured. The ovals are all white picket fenced. The buildings are the same colour, built by the same developers. And Breakfast Point as a development was going to have 10,000 people in it. But we had probably 35, maybe more like probably 50 people, of which maybe 25 were players at that time. And so me, Cam McCarthy, played for Freo after the Giants, and also Josh Kelly, who's still there to this day, we'd lived together. And we'd all been shipped in, right? Now, I knew Josh. Josh we'd played some state footy with. Cam I'd never met, and he's from, South Freo or something in Perth. And Josh is from Brighton, very different upbringing to me in Ringwood. And so they just go, here, figure it all out.
And you're 18 years old, right?
Yeah, 18, straight out of school. Like I left for Sydney 10 days after my final school exam. I was falling asleep in Sydney, first day.
Yeah.
And, you sort of get this, you talk about work friends or half friends or whatever I called them before. Imagine living with them. Right? It's like, and look, they're both great boys, right? Really genuine. I mean, I saw Josh at the grand final. He's an absolute ripper. His family are amazing. But it's a big shift. It's a big, big change in your life when you're going, great, so we're going to change everything about your footy experience and everything about your life experience. And by the way, you're now 25th pick, first round pick in the mix. Right? And with all brand new assistant coaches, it was just... they've got to build connection with the coaches, friendships. Your team sucks as well, right? And no offense to we won 3 games, mate. Yeah. And it was sign of the times. We had a bunch of kids playing against men.
Yeah. And the other thing too is there wouldn't have been so many senior players, but when you come into that environment, there's probably only a handful of 18 to 22-year-olds. Yeah. Some of those 25 to 26-year-olds, they're probably not relating to the 18-year-olds. They might have long-term girlfriends or even have a family. So
but it wasn't even that either, which I think it's a great instinct. But the reality was that in most footy clubs, right? So I'll take the Bulldogs at the moment because obviously I know them best. You have the Tom Liberatores who are the veterans of the club who are still playing good footy. Right? In my time at the Bulldogs, it was the Bob Murphys and the Matty Boyds. You then have the Bont, who's sort of right at the peak of his powers, captain of the footy club, 30 years old in, a couple of days, I think. And then you sort of go down to the Ed Richards, who's just had a fantastic year, and the Bailey Dales there, again, in the peak of their powers, but much closer to the start than the end. Like, Bond's 30. These guys are probably 26, 27. And then you have the Joel Frasers and these young guys trying to break into the side, right? Roughly. There's a streamed hierarchy of people that have grown, developed, survived, and thrived over time. At the Giants, we basically had a manufactured version of that to a degree, right? So what they got guys like Callan Ward, fantastic bloke, fantastic footballer, Phil Davis, who had an incredible career as well, and they pinched these blokes who were sort of entering their prime and paid them a fortune to come up to Sydney to start building the sort of that middle cohort that's really critical for any club. Then you had the Toby Greens, the Stephen Caniglios, the Jeremy Camerons, John Patton, all these guys who'd been there for 3 years, and I'm 2 years younger than them. And then on top of that, to try and substitute the fact that we really didn't have any older veteran players, they basically had guys on their last legs, right? So Stephen Gillam, Josh Hunt, and not to mention that, but most of those guys had stepped into coaching roles as well. So Luke Power had been a player the year before I arrived, first year as an assistant, James McDonald, et cetera, et cetera. And all I'm saying is, whilst on paper it looked closer to what a normal club should have been, it really wasn't. Everyone's priorities were different. None of those guys had been through the Giants experience to get to their prime. They'd all come in subsequent to that. And it was just it wasn't even on paper as streamlined as it should be.
But you played a handful of games in your first year, and eventually take us through this. You requested a trade. You wanted to come back to Melbourne. Before we get into sort of some of the stuff that you talk about today in your life today around your speaking and mental health and your book that you've written, but I just want to talk just that last piece of the puzzle of your sports journey. It's not the last piece because you want a premiership.
Thank God.
That's probably the last great piece. But so you've played a handful of games. You've obviously impressed enough to do well. What then happened? How did you get to the Bulldogs? Did you want the trade? You obviously weren't, feeling it in Sydney. And how did that all happen?
As you said, a handful of games. So I played 9 games in my first year. I think kicked 8 goals. I had a couple of moments, like a couple of games where I was like, oh, there's something there.
Yeah.
But in reality, what had happened was I put a lot of size on in my first year, put a huge amount of muscle on, got really quite heavy, and was used to being the sort of, the man. And was used to the ball being gravitated and being quite magnetic to the footy coming to me, and learnt very quickly that that's not how AFL footy's played. And had some very honest and blunt conversations with both Leon and, the forwards coaching and also, even Dermot Brereton coming up and teaching me what it meant to be a key forward, right? And he was amazing. And again, I look back at all of those lessons that were very uncomfortable at the time as critically important, completely changed my perspective on footy. And, even though that was the case and there was progress there, vastly speaking, it was a pretty disappointing first season. It was difficult because I was away from home and all the factors we mentioned before. The team wasn't performing particularly well, which was understandable, but equally still frustrating. And then on top of that, if you're in and out of the side, it's almost the worst case up in Sydney because, at the time at the Giants, we were travelling to Canberra for the twos, and then we're going to Gold Coast, and you were just a bit everywhere. And I really didn't enjoy that experience really at all. There were moments, of course, but for the most part, it was pretty frustrating. And one of the big things that came out of conversations with people at the club at the time was this concept of homesickness. Now, not to dive into that side of the story, but it was certainly a thing to me that made sense because I was away from home and I wasn't feeling the best. And as it so happens, when it comes to the trade, I actually got a phone call from my dad probably 10 weeks into the first year. And it was a Thursday afternoon. And he basically rang me and he said, you've had a contract offer. And I thought he was talking about the Giants, who'd already offered me a 2-year extension, right?
Oh, wow.
So when you get drafted, 2 years on your deal, I think it might be 3 now, but fact check me. And that's all wrapped up in the collective bargaining agreement, right? So there's no negotiation. It's all tiered by when you get picked and all that sort of stuff.
So you're on a base salary,
basically. Yeah. So I made $69,000 in my first year.
As a first round draft.
As a first pick, right? Yep. So there were some bonuses associated with being number one, but realistically, $69,000 plus COLA, which was this, cost of living allowance for Sydney, which everyone hated so much. To be fair, applied to the CBA, it made sense, right? Because I just got the percentage upgrade that everyone. So that made sense. The problem was obviously they just upped the salary cap by 10% and then they gave it all to Buddy. Right? That was the real problem with it. But when it was applied to basically fixed payments, it actually made sense. It was just a percentage adjustment. And then I had match payments on top of that. So I might have made 130 grand or something in my first year. So, and then they offered me a 2-year extension, which was great money, by the way. This is before I played a game. So when Dad said to me about a contract offer, I go, mate, I'm not re-signing with the Giants, right? I've already said that. I just wanted to wait. Yeah. Right? I didn't want to commit to something for 4 years that I really knew nothing about.
Yeah,
right? And that's what they try and do, right? And this is not a sinister thing. This is the right thing for them as a business and a club, which is these guys come from interstate. They're going to think about going home at some stage.
Lock them in for a quick extension, even if they haven't really proven themselves yet.
Yeah, lock them in when they're appreciative. Right? Once they still feel like thankful to be drafted. I didn't have, and maybe this is a reflection of a poor trait in me, but being pick one, I didn't feel this like deep sense of loyalty. My perspective was, I want to try and make it work here. But there's 17 other clubs that would have taken me. Yeah. And again, I was 18 at the time, right? So, for all context, I was a child, basically. Yeah. And so Dad explained to me that, I had a contract offer. To cut a long story short, we met up the following week or a few days later. And we were sitting at a pub and he, made some remarks about this contract and not giving me any detail. So I was incredibly frustrated because he sort of had buried the lead, if you will.
Did he know who it was? Did he tell you who it was?
He knew everything.
But he didn't tell you anything.
He didn't tell me anything. He just said, I'm going to come up and talk to you about it. So I'm like sitting there going, this prick. And we're sitting in this meeting. Essentially, to cut a long story short, he says from the Western Bulldogs. And I'm like, great. I don't think they're any good at the moment. They were like 14th or something. Yeah. And we actually ended up beating them in the last game of that year. In Daniel Jan Syracuse's 275th or something in last game. It wasn't great. But anyway, it was good for us, but not for them. And then he says, 7 over 7. I always thought he meant 700 grand, and he actually meant $7 million over 7 years. Yeah, and I'm sitting there going, Jesus, this is amazing. Yeah. Let's do this. Yeah. And obviously there's steps in that process that need to happen, and one of them, maybe to show a bit of light behind the scenes, because I think if you're in the footballing public or the general public, you're sitting there going, oh, these deals happen in trade period. None of these deals happen in trade period, right? All of the conversations for big ticket trades happen for 12 to 18 months beforehand. They have to.
They have to, yeah.
Right? So you've got guys who are out of contract. You've got guys who are, with a year left. They're all different scenarios, and management is constantly in communication with players, particularly if they're considering a move. And let's say in the case of like the most recent one in Christian Petracca, this has been probably ongoing for 2.5 years, realistically. Tried last year, didn't happen. Tried again this year, probably thought about it, Anyway, not to make this about that deal. But for me, one of the first steps was actually going back to Melbourne and meeting with the Bulldogs. And these deals...
Was this during season? No.
Yeah, during the season.
During the season.
Yeah, so this is during one of the bye rounds. So we can look up exactly when that was. But my hunch was that I think it's around... Maybe like 10 rounds in.
Yep.
Not like...
So you still may have you've maybe played 3 or 4 games at that stage. You played 9 for the whole season, right?
Yeah, probably 2, maybe 3. Maybe 3.
Okay, keep going. I've got so many questions. But
anyway, we meet with the club, and this is where deals blow up, right? Stuffing this part up is when deals always fail because, and there's examples every year of players meeting with other clubs during the off season, it's a disaster, right? Yeah. And it causes such angst and such pressure for members that these deals often just don't go through, right? So for us, we were very cautious of that, right? This would have been the biggest headline in the league.
It would have been huge. You just got there.
Yeah, 5 months in, he's already trying to get out sort of thing. And, we went to Peter Gordon's house in East Hawthorn, and we basically met up at a cafe, me, my management, and my dad. And we left the meeting separately, drove in separate directions, sneakily met up around the corner just to make sure there was no chance that people would connect the dots that we were going somewhere together, right? And then we drive into a motorcade underground to Peter's underground car park in East Hawthorn, and we sit down. We have this 2-hour meeting. And again, to cut a long story short, essentially we got to the end of that, and it was Ryan Griffin and Marcus Bontempelli realistically were the only 2 players on their list that could have caused a trade or even the conversation about a trade, right? Because the Giants would just say, no, we're not trading Tom. We just drafted him at pick 1, huge amount of equity we put into him. This asset's one we want to keep, no chance. And they said, no, we're not trading Bont or Griff. So we were like, great, we'll have to wait 12 months. And it wasn't actually until I was away at the end of the off season when Griffin asked for a trade that this deal even looked like it would go through at all.
Oh, so they were like, that's when he asked for a trade, then they had currency to be able to negotiate for you to come in.
Yeah, and he was captain, right? He was captain of the footy club. It was a disaster for them to have their captain want to leave. Shortly thereafter, they sacked the coach and, the CEO left a couple of months later.
You came in when Bevo came in.
Yeah, I came in
at the
before
same time.
him.
Oh, you came in just before him.
Yeah, so I didn't have a coach for 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah. So then they did the deal. You came on. Did you ever go to Dad or the money? Why did they? It just seems bad. Why did they have to throw so much money at you? Would you, when you said, "Oh, was it $700,000?" You probably would have taken $700,000. I'm just thinking as an accountant now. Like, why would you offer $1 million for 7 years?
Yeah.
Did they just think you were going to say no to anything else? Like.
Yeah, I mean, the burden of risk to ask for a trade in my position was supremely high, right? Like, if I'd said to them, to the Giants, let's say at the end of my first season, without this Griffin piece happening, hey, I'm going to leave, and I've been offered, it doesn't matter what money, it would have been a disaster.
Yeah.
And it could have genuinely ruined my career.
Yeah.
And that's not an overstatement.
Agree with that.
The suffering I would have gone through for 12 months subsequent to that, if I had returned to the Giants, would have been also unbearably challenging. And so I think there's that component. That's one part. The other part is you need to put the opposition club in a position that they can't compete, which happens all the time, right? This is the St Kilda method in the last 8 weeks.
Yeah.
We're just going to make it impossible for them to compete because we've got some capital at the moment. And the reason why they have capital typically is that, as I understand it, and it may have some tweaks and changes since then, but there is a minimum spend required by AFL clubs to meet the salary cap, right?
Yeah, so they've got to spend X 90% or whatever it is. Yeah.
I think it's closer to 100. It's 95 or above, I think. So they have a floor as well as a cap. And what happens is if you spend under the cap for a number of years, you essentially have to spend that money.
Oh.
And so one of the big things that happens is that, you see teams like St Kilda, there's a good chance, and I don't know this for a fact, but there's a good chance St Kilda were under the cap for a couple of years and they go, we've got to get back up. Otherwise, we're going to get penalised for not having spent the money we're supposed to spend. And so to answer your question, there's a few factors essentially. And this also, probably maybe the last component that falls into this, it wasn't exactly like the Bulldogs were desirable destination number one at that stage. I had the opportunity to open up conversations, let's say, with Carlton, who were a much bigger club, who had much more to sell.
Plus you barracked for them.
Yeah, plus I barracked for them. And we knew sort of quite a few people at the club at the time. So there's also this take you away from your hometown discount, but also there's if we're no good, right? Again, no offense to St Kilda supporters, but St Kilda haven't been a successful club in the last 5 or 6 years. And therefore, they're having to spend more to convince players that they need to come and be the change St Kilda need rather than join a club like Hawthorn or someone who's been successful in recent years.
So you're at Bulldogs. I want to keep going, but let's take us to the premiership. Mm-hmm. So how was you had a lot of injuries though, even at the Bulldogs. You had an issue with your shoulder.
Ankles, back, fingers, you name it.
When did you won a premiership, but it wasn't the best career from an injury perspective. You just couldn't get on the park. When did the mental health and the challenges of getting up in the morning and grinding through recovery, being on the injury list, did you start feeling the pressure of the mental health kick in? Because you retired not long after the premiership, a couple of years after, I believe. Mm-hmm. Take us through the journey to the premiership and how your mental health was, and obviously the injuries. And then you had a great game. And I want to unpack that and then dive into some of the stuff you're doing today.
To be clear, I would say that the 3 things that caused me to miss the most footy in my career were a shoulder injury, which probably kept me out for 5 or 6 weeks, mental health leave, which kept me out for 6 or 7.
Yeah.
And then a back injury, which kept me out for 6 or 7 as well. So I actually didn't miss that many games, realistically.
Correct.
I played quite a few in the VFL or in the NEFL up in Sydney. And so I don't know exactly what the count would be, but I must have played something around 100 games in 5.5 years, which is pretty much like, it's not much off the pace. Like you have guys obviously like Bont or Josh Kelly up until recently who basically don't miss any footy, but that's irregular for key position players in particular. So in terms of the volume of footy played, I played a lot during that time, but I missed basically these 3 big buckets. Like I'll give you an example of when I didn't miss footy. We played a game in Port Adelaide where I compound dislocate my finger with 5 minutes to go, right? Bones coming out, blood's gone everywhere. It's disgusting. So I put it back in. I go off. instead of flying home the next morning, I believe, I get straight on a plane so that I can get back to Melbourne and have surgery straight away when I get home the next morning, which I wouldn't have been able to do if I flew out with the team. And me and Lucas Webb, who was a teammate of mine, he had a wrist surgery to do as well, so we both left. I had my finger operated on, cleaned up. I woke up in surgery because you're only sort of, you have basically a sedative, not an anesthetic, and talked to the surgeon for 2 minutes, went back to sleep. Anyway, I played that Friday night.
Wow.
You turn around in 6 days. So
wow.
Players are extraordinarily resilient. They have to be. And that's the way that the club and the business is set up, right? You have an asset that's worth, let's call it $1 million a year for me at the time, that essentially can work 26 weeks of the year if you play all of them. And the likelihood they're going to let you sit on the sidelines is almost zero, right? I hurt my shoulder quite badly in my first season at the Giants. I played the next week, right? The surgeon sat me down, said, you need surgery. I play the next week. And that's it's not woe-be Tom. Like, everyone does this. It just depends to what degree. And so to answer your question around the mental health stuff, I think the first experience that I had when it came into the fold for me was really when I was at the Giants, right? And it came in a really simple way, which was I just couldn't sleep at night. And, it didn't make any sense to me because I was so tired, right? I was exhausted. I was doing 50 or 60 Ks a week on the training track or thereabouts in Sydney. First AFL preseason is the hardest thing you ever do. All these extra training, cardio, boxing, whatever, gym, Pilates, and so on and so forth physically. Then you got to learn a new team, a new town, a new game plan, a new way of life. You're exhausted. And so for me, the concept of me not being able to sleep was completely strange. And I was really just sitting there freaking out about everything and all the issues and stressed and mind racing and all that sort of stuff. So that was number one. The second thing for me was that off the back of that, I started to have this sort of, I probably would have called it nervousness at the time, but, call it stress, call it anxiety, whatever you want to call it. It was basically like I just couldn't calm myself down. And it was like I was amping myself up for, a big game of footy or a exam, which had been relevant obviously at that time for me. But the problem was there was nothing going on. It was like a Wednesday afternoon and this would happen.
And that feeling would come up.
It would just be like completely disproportionate to what life was actually throwing at me.
Yeah.
And that's where the conversation around homesick came, because people could just sense that when I answered questions about how I was going, I was a bit sort of, oh, yeah, but.
Yeah. And plus you're a great speaker and you'd play on the moon.
Yeah,
so
right.
all of a sudden there was seen a shift in that as well.
And they're going, great, well, you're probably just homesick. And so that for me, I dismissed the concept. I didn't really understand mental health at all at this stage. Now, I made a mistake that I see people make all the time twice, really distinctly in my life. And that mistake is something that goes, and I talk about this a lot in my public speaking. The number one ticket item you'll talk to about business people is they'll say, I've just got to get to Christmas, right? I've just got to get through the next 5 or 6 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And that's one example. I'll give you 50 of them, of people saying, I've got some stuff I've got to deal with. I just can't at the moment. I just don't feel like I can, right? Whether they're comfortable to do it, capable, got the capacity, whatever. And they kick the can down the road like Christmas is this magical solution, when really what happens at Christmas is we all socialise heaps. Then we get through to the new year, we fall in a heap, we go, great, we're going to spend some time with the family and the kids, try and quieten it down, and all of a sudden, the first day back at work's knocking in our door and the stress levels go straight back up. And I did that thinking that the world was magically going to fix things. When I left the Giants, I was like, homesick, I'll just move back to Victoria. It makes sense, everything will be fine. And I also did that when I stood on the stage of the MCG in 2016, because I'd had an extraordinary amount of issues with sleep and depression and anxiety off the field throughout that 2-year span at the Bulldogs, 15 and 16. And, every time that I thought it was never going to end, it did, right? I'd have this 2 or 3 weeks and everything would be great again. I'd be like, great, it's all gone. And, it'll never come back. And it always did. And I thought to myself particularly, and again, I think this is something that people do all the time, that winning a premiership, 21-year-old premiership player, first time in 62 years for the club, first time in history to win from 7th position on the home and away ladder at the end of the year, $1 million to play the game that I've loved since I was 5, right? I was like, that recipe has to equal someone being happy. There's no other way around it. Like
if you played it out and told someone, are you happy at the end of that?
That's right.
But
unfortunately, that's not the case. Like, how many people have you met over the years, clients and otherwise, who are extraordinarily well off in most facets of their life? And that's not just money, that's family and whatever, the lifestyle they have, and they're miserable. They're absolutely miserable because something is broken, something's not working. And I thought that broken piece, that issues, the list that I had that was massive was going to be fixed by winning a premiership. I was like, oh, it's all fixed now.
And you played such a great game.
That's right. I have the moment, right? I had one of the great moments in grand final history, and I say that as humbly as I can, right? No one else has made Brian Taylor swear on radio but me. You know? And I'm like, it's magically going to fix it. And in my mind, from my perspective and experience of talking to 500 different groups and businesses over 5 years, having worked intimately with, countless businesses as well, this is the same problem that everyone goes through, which is the future's going to fix my issues. I'm not going to fix them today. I'll kick the can and hope that it magically resolves itself. There's some magical fairyland and utopia in the future where I've got all this time, effort, and space that I can apply to this issue to fix it. And it never happens, ever.
Yeah.
I've never seen it happen once.
Yeah.
What I have seen happen is the same story that I had, which is push and push and push and push. And everyone will say, I was a 3-year push in my AFL career. Yeah, but I started playing professionally, quote unquote, at least semi-professionally when I was 12 years old.
Correct.
Hadn't stopped. And I got to the peak and then fell in a heap the next year, right? And I was lucky that I had great support, great people.
So it was bad for you the year after the premiership. That was probably the worst. Okay.
Yeah, the worst. So in the middle of 2017, I was still playing footy at the top level. Hadn't slept in a couple of weeks, getting injured, getting sick, couldn't remember anything. It was a nightmare, right? It was the worst time in my life by far. And that came, 8 months essentially off the back of the greatest day in my professional career. And I think, to be honest, so often that's the case with people, right? You've just pushed to this ultimate goal of where I want to get to, and then you wake up the next day, you've realised the world hasn't changed, you've still got the same problems, everyone expects more of you, they expect the Bulldogs to go back to back and Tom to be the next Tom Hawkins in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I'd come off 2 surgeries.
Yeah.
I'd come off no off-season, no pre-season, trying to get back out. And, these things happen. And
when that happened and you were going through a tough time in 2017, did someone tap you on the shoulder and say, Tom, you don't look good. I'm going to put my arm around you and help you? Or did you know enough to go, I need some help here? How did that play out?
Look, I think, take it the Are You OK Day campaign, right? It's become a big corporate ticket item, right? It's something I do a lot of work around. And I think there is real value in this concept of let's heighten the focus and awareness and attention on one thing and just break through the conversation barrier so that we can actually talk about this stuff year round. I do think there's value in that, even though it is one day and we should be thinking about this stuff all the time. But one of the big things that they pushed in the early stages, and I think this is a question I get asked so often, is how do we spot the signs and symptoms? Like, one, it depends on the person. Right, I could fake it like no one. Right, it's like the cliche king, same stuff. But equally, there's an underlying message in this spot the signs and symptoms. Even though, by the way, I think it's important to learn what they are. There's an underlying expectation of people to walk around and psychoanalyze their friends, family, workforce, colleagues, peers, whatever. Yeah. It's unrealistic in most cases. Right, we're all busy. We've all got our own issues. And what's actually fundamentally more important in my mind is building relationships that are conducive to having conversations around this stuff with people that you care about and care about you, right? Because that's where you're actually going to talk to this stuff. Now, I didn't do that second part at all, right? I lied or I withheld or I hid all of these issues extraordinarily well and really didn't get to the help part with anyone in my mind in a meaningful way until I got to the worst state when I really had to put my hand up and be like, this is not working, And I don't talk about the deep depths of some of the things that I was thinking, but fair to say that, it was a very rough period of time for me. It was an extraordinarily lonely period of time, not through the fault of anyone else, but through me pushing them away. And I really ran out of options. And thankfully, and I talk to people about this all the time as well, I was lucky, right? I had a psychologist at the club who I knew, who I didn't have to build a relationship with because it already existed.
Have to probably pay.
Didn't have to pay, but the pay barrier is not as big as
it's not
mate, I've got to go and share my thoughts with a stranger.
Yeah.
Mate, you're crazy. What if they're not the right fit for me? Which, by the way, happens. And it still took me that long. And, it was really a then 2-year process to get back to anywhere near my best because unfortunately when you let these things play out for long periods of time, subsequently,
it takes longer
to bounce back.
So once you then started to get help and start to talk to people, when was the decision to retire? Because you walked away from money. You could have easily just played out your contract, be injured, play reserves.
Apparently,
Because that's commendable what you did, right?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do feel like, I didn't feel like I had a choice, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't have lived with myself, I don't think, if I'd sat there and
just.
But, we've found out, let's say, without making this about any one player in particular, we found out in the last 2 years that there is ironclad contracts in the AFL, right? And they are completely indisputable, and players can essentially do nothing and get paid the contract that they sign. All of the exposures on the club side. And that was certainly the case back then. But for me, after spending a lot of time getting back to what I sort of would consider normal Tom, I got injured in 2018, hurt my back quite badly, and it was quite a frustrating experience. Backs are really hard to communicate to people. It's kind of like you're better off breaking your arm because everyone can see a sling.
Yeah.
Backs are really tricky because people can't imagine. If you haven't had back pain, it's hard to express to people what it's like and how it impacts everything you do, as opposed to like when I've had a bad shoulder, I can pretty much do everything I want. I can even run with a bad shoulder. And so I was on the sidelines and, albeit frustrated, I was actually in a pretty good mental state. Like I was sort of, I suppose, contemplating what I wanted to do with my life. And I sort of felt like I was at this stage where, I was half in it. I was sort of still trying to do everything right, still having good interactions at the club, still trying to do my rehab. But it just didn't feel like I wanted to do this anymore. And it got to a point in May 2019 where I basically said, to the club after a couple of other conversations, hey, I'm going to stop. I'm going to retire and give back over $2 million of unpaid salary. And I'm going to walk away. I'm going to be one of these few players to actually leave the game on their own terms. And the examples that I use, many of the greats of the game, right? They don't get to do the Ring of Honor until 5 or 6 years after they've retired. They don't get to walk out of these clubs, have a retirement speech, say goodbye, have everyone happy about it because the game moves on, right? If you finish at a different club, Luke Hodge finished at a different club, he was traded or whatever, right? And he won 4 premierships. And that's just an example of how the AFL world works. So the fraction of people get to do what I did and to walk out, smile on my face, excited for what was next is so small. And I think, for all the things that I've regretted in my life, this is one that I really never have. I think it really left people with the right impression of me. And I think that there is something undeniable about the decision I made to go, I'm going to give it all up to go and take that next step rather than trying to have my cake and eat it too.
So now it's footy after life. How did you get into the next phase of your career? You probably didn't know what you wanted to do. You're recovering. Take us through what will look like 12, 18 months later. And then you wrote a book and you do amazing stuff in the mental health space. You're an amazing speaker and I've heard you talk. How did you get into where you are today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, to take it to the decision to actually move on, there's a big difference, right? And it's evident 100% of the time in the outcomes that people get between running away from something and running towards something, right? So if you're making a decision to leave, you need to be leaving to go somewhere else rather than just leaving for the sake of it. Because if you do the ladder, you sort of end up in the void, right? It's like, where am I going next? I didn't like that, so now I'm somewhere else. It's not a positive move in my experience for people. And so for me, that North Star was really this mental health conversation, but I really didn't know what it looked like. And, when I left the game, again, it was sort of midway through the season. So people say to me, oh, do you hate footy? I mean, like, mate, I played community footy that year. I left the game, went back to play at my local club. That's how interested I was in staying in football. Now, the AFL isn't representative of all football. It's a very competitive environment and one that I didn't feel was conducive to the long-term success of me. But football is probably, barring my family, is basically the most influential thing that's ever happened to me in my life. I've grown up there. I've lived there. My whole experience has been based around footy clubs. And so for me, getting back involved in the footy club was a really important community aspect to what I wanted to do. I started to, not through any sort of efforts of my own, get asked to come and speak places, right? And the first one was at a place called Westbourne Grammar, which is a great school out near Werribee. And they said, hey, can Tom come talk to the kids, And I was like, well, I should say yes. I feel like it's important. And I wrote this speech, which was like 5,000 words. And, mate, to say I nailed the preparation, it was phenomenal. I thought I was Barack Obama. I read it and read it and read it at practice. Probably did it 30 times in the 3 weeks leading up to this event.
Done.
And I got there and I sat in the car and I couldn't remember the first paragraph.
Oh, no.
And I'm just absolutely, freaking out, going, do I call my manager? Do I say I'm sick? I was at the school. I was like, I'm just going to have to wing it. Now, obviously, because of the preparation, once I got up there and got going, for the most part, it went really, really well, right? 30 minutes. Not many people can speak for 30 minutes. And I don't use notes ever, right? Never use notes. And I was like, I think I can do that again. And so I spent a bit of time sort of setting my 2020 year up, right? I met with a few of the bureaus, the speaking bureaus. They organize a lot of this stuff and they sort of take talent on and whatever. And I probably had 30 or 40 engagement booked. I'm like, great, financially, I'm going to be fine next year.
Yeah.
Right. And I will make mention that after I retired, the first thing my dad did was come over and do a budget.
I love that. Good on him.
For my first speaking engagement for 2020, and this will end up somewhere that makes sense to your question, and it was in a place called Kimber, which is basically past the Augusta Peninsula in South Australia, so just before the Nullarbor. It just so happens it's Corey Enright's hometown, fantastic All-Australian for Geelong. And it was the night of his 20th year high school reunion. Now, he wasn't at my event. He was in the pub next door.
No way.
It just so happens. And, I did this event and Kimber had a lot of challenges and it was a great event. It was a great experience. And I really felt like I sort of connected with the audience. I was just starting to get up and going. This is probably my 5th or 6th gig. I flew home to Melbourne, stopping in first Whyalla and then over to Adelaide and home. And it was either the next day or the day after that COVID hit. And every single gig that I had for the year was gone. I had a renovation plan for my house. That left. That was gone. And, subsequent to that, like everyone, spent a whole heap of time inside that year. And it was in that moment that I sort of worked out two things. One, I needed something to work on, right? And I didn't have a job. And the first thing that I did was I know I can write, so I'll write my story. And I did my first attempt at the book, which came out a couple of years later, and I sort of wrote 60,000 words in my house in Albert Park in the bedroom sort of thing. And the second thing I realised was this was the first time that I'd never had a team around me, ever.
Yeah.
Right?
Makes sense.
And that was very strange for me. Now, I do it to this day, a heap of work on my own, and I love it. But at the same time, this was the moment where I looked to engage with a business to try and actually find a home. And that's where I found the home at Everperform, right? And so over that next 18 months, basically I wrote the book the first time, got the deal with the publisher, rewrote it with them, did 180,000 words in 2021, started this work with Everperform, started engaging with clients and really around how we could support their sort of well-being of their staff. And eventually got to a point where I was like, this all starting to make sense. You fast forward to 2025, I probably do 80 to 100 speaking gigs a year. I've got great partnerships with WorkSafe. I've worked a lot with Lifeline in the past, Movember, RecLink Australia, the Western Bulldogs Foundation. I do SEN, I do Wellness Wednesdays each week. I've done sort of 3 months of that. And some additional media stuff surrounding certain campaigns and the like.
And you're here on the bottom line.
And I'm here on the pinnacle of 2025, being here on the bottom line with you, mate. So, and I think, people ask me how I manage to do all these things because frankly, it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
And I do a very different way of working than a lot of people. And the short answer is the only physical, mental and emotional way that it is possible is because everything that I do, whether it be media and ambassadorships, whether it be speaking or whether it be the work with Everperform, is all flying in the same direction, which is to help people reach their potential by helping them to get over the start line, right? There's a lot to be said about this high performance conversation. Most people don't ever get there, Really what we're talking about is people both professionally and personally getting in their own way in some way, shape or form, often through no fault of their own, and not really being able to get even on the journey to reaching their potential. And that for me, if you look at the community in various different sectors is really my passion.
What are some of the tips? You talked about kicking the can down the road and that I just got to get to Christmas. I hear that a lot with clients. I kind of nearly hear it with some of the staff.
Of course,
even I've said that in the past. It's like this, it's like the marathon runner that's at the last kilometre. It's just trying to get to the finish line. That's
with a finish line that keeps moving.
Yeah, it just keeps getting away from you. What tips do you have for people that are exhausted, they're not sleeping well, they may or may not know that it's depression or anxiety? What tips do you have for someone that just goes, this is really, I'm struggling? Where do they get help? What's the steps? What are some things? Yeah. Even if it's not just steps to getting help, but just breathing exercises. Like, just give us some takeaways.
Yeah, everyone wants the silver bullet.
Yeah.
Let maybe take it up a step, because I think mental health is one of only a few really significant challenges people face, right? And, mental health is connected to all of the things in our lives. It's our physical health. It's our relationships. It's our, financial capability and health to actually pay our bills. All that stuff matters. And for me, I think fundamentally the mistake that I fell into, rather than becoming the expert on recommending everything that works, I can certainly talk to a little bit of that. But the mistake that I fell into was, when I grew up, my old man is probably the toughest person I've ever met. And I don't say that lightly. I've met some very tough people in life and in business. He's always been that way, footy. And he used to really push that agenda with me when we were younger, right? About how tough people tend to be successful, right? People who can find their way through it. And he's absolutely right, we've both seen people over the years who are more capable of dealing with stress or adversity or different issues or whatever. If they can find a way to manage it, they tend to just survive long enough. Now, the problem with what Dad said to me is not the concept. It's that he never gave me any clear direction about what that actually meant. Right? I didn't know what a tough person actually was, right? I knew what they looked like, or what I thought they looked like, which is basically grit your teeth and argue with everyone, which is what Dad was like. But what Dad was really good at, and what most tough people are really good at, is they're just great problem solvers. They're great at solving a variety of problems using a variety of tools. And it's actually their capability to, one, set themselves up with the tools in the first place, but two, to pick to shovel for the right job, if you know what I mean. And the reason why I bring that up as an answer to your question is, if you think about recommending things to people, here's what fixes things. The problem with that is that the internet, Instagram in particular, I don't have TikTok because I'm too old for that, is filled with people with simple solutions to complicated problems. They're absolutely everywhere, and they're all wrong, right? They might be right for some people, but they're guaranteed to be wrong with other parts of their audience. And so I don't take the perspective of going out there and saying, fundamentally, you should be doing this. But there are certainly different ways that you can do it. And I think the other nuance to this conversation is you won't find a bigger proponent for psychologists than me, good ones in particular, right? Because there's not all good ones, just by nature of the fact that humans aren't perfect. But psychologists are a specific tool for a specific circumstances, right? If you're trying to manage these types of things that are quite challenging and you feel like you need professional help, you will not find someone who's a bigger proponent for that than me. I'm an absolute avid fan. I have a great relationship with my psych. I don't see her anymore professionally, but she's been probably one of the most influential people in my entire life. But there are also the other tools that are available. There's things like breathing and exercise, and, I go in the ocean every day. That helps. Spending time with my family is a massive thing. Connecting with my daughter, my friends, my colleagues, asking advice from people like you who are in positions of influence and stress yourself, right? I need to know what works for you, because there's actually, a new perspective that you might have that might actually apply to certain situations, and so on and so forth, right? And it's building the repertoire of these skills rather than thinking there's like an off-the-shelf method that you can just go and say, great, this page, okay, this fixes this problem. It's not how it works. And I think, this concept of resilience has been commandeered by a whole range of people and businesses and whatever over the years, as great words do. Culture would be another one, in my opinion, to mean this strange thing that you can just learn, right? You can just learn resilience. The other end of the spectrum is if you just suffer through enough stuff, you get more resilient. Neither of them are true, right? The answer, as typical, is somewhere in the middle, which is through learning what skills are available, through experiencing and applying those skills, you will become more resilient over time. But it's not a magical thing that you can just pick up, learn in a seminar, or magically get by suffering through. Because, by the way, my approach on, this suffering through thing, it didn't get any more resilient. It got worse, got less tough, less capable, and less effective, and less good as a person over time by thinking I just had to hang on.
Great words of wisdom there. Lots of takeaways from that. And I really resonate to having the friendships and getting to know someone really well and helping those people. You can't really help someone that you don't have a connection with, because they're not going to be overly colleagues. What an awesome conversation. Before I let you go, what's on for the plans? What's the plans for 2026? Anything exciting happening? I want to mention the book. I love the headline.
There's the one thing I didn't come up with.
I love the title, Nowhere to Hide. So if you haven't read the book, you got to read the book, Nowhere to Hide. Tom, what's the plans for 2026? Is there another book on the horizon? What are the plans?
Yeah, I've got another child due, so probably by the time this comes out, there'll be another Boyd in the household, which will be great. Equally, I've got a big project, which I don't think I'm allowed to announce yet, that's coming out.
Awesome.
So stay tuned for that, and give me a follow on LinkedIn or anything else just to keep up to date with the things that are coming. I think, to be honest, it's more of the same. But I think maybe the really specific conversations that are happening at the moment is we've got new regulations surrounding mental health in the workplace. It's a big thing for businesses, and that's the work that Everperform does. So more and more, that's going to become a part of how businesses actually systematise support of their staff.
Yeah.
And by the way, try and create a relationship that's a bit more symbiotic than it probably is at the moment, because there are some great challenges between what expected returns businesses have versus what the staff are, expecting to put in. It's shifted a lot in the last 10 years in particular. I think on top of that, this conversation surrounding mental health has become probably the most prevalent one that I would say I see in society. I'm obviously a bit biased based on the experience and the work that I do, but by and large, it seems to be dominating the ecosystem, more than anything else. And I think, unfortunately, that's because there are so many people who are either experiencing it themselves or within the people surrounding them. So supporting that conversation, and many of the great organisations who make material difference in that area will continue to be a focus of mine. And then I think just continuing to try and find, joy in the work that I do, right? So much of what we do when we're incredibly busy, it ends up being just another thing. And I think one of the big things that I'll try and do and continue to do is to actually appreciate the experiences that you do get to have throughout the working day and my working life, because it is special and it is an amazing thing to be able to do. And I'm just looking forward to more of that.
Tom, thank you so much for joining me today. You've given up a lot of your time, and thank you for having me on SCN. I love the chat, and I wish you all the best for 2026. And yeah, I want to thank you for all the work that you do, because it is so important. We have a lot of data and a lot of knowledge around, if you get mental health right and you can, be physically active, physically well, but if you get the mental side right, you're a happier person, you can do lots of good things. And I just want to say thank you for being such an advocate for the industry and doing great things. So thank you, Tom, for joining me today.
Appreciate it.